Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Inept General, and welcome to part 2 of our Alith Anar lore video, The Making of a King. To summarize a little bit, in part 1 we covered a lot of territory. We joined Alith as a young boy growing up in Alandra, his ancestral home in the lands of Naggareth. He was going through a time of enormous tumult, where war had broken out in Ulthuan for the first time. Elf against elf fought each other. The cults led by Morathi, the wife of the once king of all the elven people, was leading mad cultists around the whole of the princedom. This was undone by her son Malekith, who came back to reclaim his crown as the Prince of Naggareth with the help of the Anar family, who let him through the gates of his capital to allow him to overthrow his mother. However, that was not the end of the cults. They persisted for a long time, and eventually war broke out yet again, with the Anars themselves coming under investigation, Alith and his whole family. Then, with war and them being under investigation and house arrest, they sent Alith off to see the second Phoenix King in the court of Tiranoc. He went off, had a few misadventures, in which time he died, and is at this time suspected to have killed himself. Alith decides to flee Tiranoc after it was taken over by the elves of Naggareth, some of which had flipped over to the side of a newly released Morathi. So Morathi is at war again, this time with the entire island of Ulthuan, and Alith Anar returned home with a party of refugees from the taking of the capital of Tiranoc. Alith returned home, and he and his father and his grandfather fought a guerrilla war against the forces of Morathi, crippling them and slowing her invasion into Greater Ulthuan. This served to allow the rest of Ulthuan to get its act together and forge a new alliance, crown a new Phoenix King, this time named Imric of Calador, and they began an open resistance. The Anars at this point, Alith and his father, decided to fight with this new Phoenix King and march their forces out to join him. They were intercepted by a dark elf army. The two fought, and with the aid of a black dragon, the forces of the Anars were obliterated. In the time that it took Alith to escape the pursuing army, his home, his family, his people, and his lands had all been burned, save for his grandfather, who had been taken hostage by the forces of Morathi. And it's here, standing in front of the funeral pyre of his family, his people, and his home, that we rejoin Alith on his journeys. As the dying embers of the pyre burn out, Alith turns and wanders into the mountains by himself. He wanders for hours, if not days. He loses all sense of himself, all sense of time, and is just a shadow. Finally, after wandering an untold distance, he broke. His psyche couldn't take any more, and he just collapsed. He let out an anguished cry, venting out all of his fury and rage in one single lasting scream. So long and forced was this shout that it's said to have turned into a howl, reminiscent of the howling of a wolf. This went on for hours. Eventually, his vocal cords gave out and he could scream and howl no longer. When that happened, he ripped at the grass around him, desperate for any way to vent the rage that has gripped his heart. He tore up tufts of grass. He then drew his blade and started slashing at trees. Eventually, his legs and arms gave out through sheer exhaustion, and he stumbled into a freezing stream. There, exhausted, he pounded strenuously at the water itself with the last of his energy. On his knees, in that stream, he was a haunting figure, his face coated black with the soot of the funeral pyre, with clear streaks exposing his pale flesh underneath his eyes, where he had wept all the tears he could bring himself to weep for his lost family and loved ones. There, sitting in the stream, he sat for hours. He was freezing, but he no longer cared. His sword was bent and blunted through the battering of the trees around him. He drew his dagger from its sheath He cut off his long hair in an act of self-hatred. He held his blade to his throat. He would end his suffering, but hesitated. Living, but then hesitated. This pain and anguish he felt, this living, would be the punishment for his hubris. Out of the shadows emerged the crow messenger of the goddess Moraheg. This messenger had long since been a part of Alith's life, dropping in and giving him pieces of advice from time to time. The goddess of destiny at this stage, he felt, was just toying with him. "Begone!" he shouted at the messenger. But behind him emerged the grandson of the Phoenix King, his mother, and the family of Yazir, the man who had helped him escape Tiranoc. He couldn't believe they had lived through the slaughter of Alandra. The messenger looked up at Alith. "Go to Illyrian like you should have done to begin with when you escaped Tiranoc." Alith, not wanting to be involved anymore in anything, really, just said, "Go there without me." "To stay here in anguish is not in your destiny, Alith Anar," the messenger replied. "Ha! Ha ha!" laughed Alith back in his face. "What new tortures does Moraheg, the goddess of fate and destiny, have planned for me? You are to become an instrument of vengeance, Alith. Or are you going to allow the last act of the Anars to be a shameful one?" "No," replied Alith. "Let the Druki claim they wiped out the Anars?" "No," again replied Alith. "Forgive them or shelter here in your self-pity?" "No, he would not." Alith, finally standing upon his feet, in that moment decided he would become a fear itself for the Druki. The group then gathered together and started to head in the direction of Illyrian through the woods. The journey itself was to take about 11 days on horseback. During the course of the journey, the messenger revealed to Alith that he was not the only crow messenger of Moraheg. There were in fact others, many of whom had turned to the orders of Morathi, and they would be actively hunting them, although he thinks he may have evaded them. That was not to be their luck, however, and a few days later, they noticed in the distance that they were in fact being pursued. Their pace quickened towards Illyrian, but the pace of the other crow messengers was quicker than their own. As the days wore on, they grew closer and closer to Illyrian. Eventually, they crested over one of the great mountains, and they saw the plains of Illyrian in front of them, but they had been doggedly pursued for days now. They knew that the other crow messengers, driven on by Morathi, were right on their tail, and they would not make it in time. They rode on. They had to be a point where they could maybe defend themselves. They were looking for anything, and eventually they came across a woodman's lodge. There, exhausted, they couldn't run any longer and had to make a stand. They tied up the horses and took shelter within the lodge itself, barricading it as best they could. Almost as soon as they'd finalized the barricade, they heard the door try to be opened for the first time. This was preceded by loud thudding around all of the walls, the windows, the roof, all of which they'd barricaded shut, and their visibility was limited. Then they started to smell smoke. They knew what had happened. They were going to be burnt out. And the thuds they were hearing were not people hitting against the wall, but indeed flaming arrows being shot against it. The flames made their way through the windows first, burning up what little protection they'd managed to put in front of them and causing them to burn themselves open. One of Dress's wife caught fire. They managed to pat down the flames before they managed to burn the woman herself. Now it was just a matter of time. They'd either die in the flames or die outside at the hands of the crow messengers. This had been expedited. The messengers were firing arrows through the open windows, and one caught one of their party in the leg, causing them to fall to the ground in pain. Things were not looking good. The flames had taken to the roof, and now it was but a matter of time. Alith had no choice. He leapt from the window, blade in hand, and traded slashes with one of the crows. Alith managed to dodge underneath one of the arms of the swings of the crow and push him back against the wall of the lodge. Then the enemy swung again. Alith ducked the blow and in one smooth motion slashed upwards, directly up the front of the enemy crow, causing him to spin, at which point Alith stabbed him straight in the back. His his eyes filled with hate, Alith turned with his back to the lodge. He was surrounded by a number of enemies, and he knew this was it. He had no chance of survival. Just then, however, a horn blew from the tree line as cavalry burst forward, driving into the enemy crows, taking them down one after the other. Alith had been saved, but by who? This was in fact the Illyrian cavalry. 100 mounted elven warriors managed to chase off, if not kill, the remainder of the enemy crow messengers. Then they turned to Alith and his little party, surrounding them, spears pointed directly at these unknown intruders. Not knowing or able to confirm their identity, the soldiers of Illyrian bound Alith and his party and were taking them to Tor Ilir, the capital of Illyrian. Eventually, they found their way to the capital and were sent to the throne room of the Prince of Illyrian, who was sat on his throne with a silver crown about his head. But to his right, Alith could not take his eyes off a beautiful elven woman sat there. This had stirred feelings in him he had not really felt since Ashneel, his fiancée who he had lost touch with many years ago when she was sent to the court of Anlek. She had the hair of a goddess and deep green eyes. This was Athiel, the sister of the Prince of Illyrian. Alith opened his mouth to speak. "Say nothing," the prince said. "Who is the leader of this group?" "My name is Alith. Did I ask your name? Explain what you are doing in my borders." Alith went on his sort of long and terribly told stories, as Alith was not a particularly good storyteller, and Alith was believed, maybe not for himself because he was such a terrible storyteller, but the daughter-in-law of the Phoenix King with the grandson of the Phoenix King came forward and identified themselves, and so the party were welcomed to the court of Illyrian. And a great feast was to be had to celebrate their survival, not only from Tiranoc, but from the burning of Alandra as well. Alith, however, as one might guess, not 2 weeks since the slaughter of his family, was not necessarily in the mood for a feast, and so kind of kept to himself and was looking to leave the party early. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the arrival of Athiel, the beauty, and kind of went over and talked to her. And in that kind of conversation, he decided that maybe this wasn't too bad a place to stay for the time being. These feelings in him he wanted to explore. And it gave him maybe hope that there was life after the slaughter of his family. So that is where Alith Anar stayed, in the court of Illyrian for many seasons. So the seasons passed one after the other, and he'd actually lost track of how long he'd spent there. He was living kind of a nice and relatively comfortable life. More refugees, however, poured into Illyrian every day from Nagaryth as the cults continued their stranglehold over the whole of Alith's home princedom. Eventually, they got to such a point that the Prince of Illyrian was looking to join the new Phoenix King, Imric of Calador, in his fight against Morathi and the cultists, and he wanted to make use of all the military assets at his disposal. In so doing, he summoned Alith to the throne room and asked Alith if he would lead the fighting men who'd made their way with the refugees from Nagaryth and lead them to back up his army when going to fight for the Phoenix King against these Druki. Alith agreed and went to the Nagarothi camp to meet the people who'd made it across the mountains to seek refuge in Illyrian. Amongst them, he saw some familiar faces and some of the original shadows who had in fact gone and opened the gates of Anlek way back when. Now, amongst these troops, many had been actually fighting with him and his family at the Battle of Dark Fen, where Alith's father had been killed by a dragon rider. Eventually, the kind of leaders of the refugees came up to Alith requesting orders. He was the most senior there, the most noble, and so they're like, Alith, what do we do? What are we going to do now? We're all lost, we're all here, we're refugees. And Alith simply looked at them all in the eye and said, "We will fight the Druki until our last breath," which was greeted by rapturous applause, for these were people out for vengeance for these lunatics who had usurped their homeland. So, the Prince of Illyrian gets his troops together and they begin to march to meet the Phoenix King through the Eagle Pass. Now, ahead of them, a Druchii army had actually been spotted, and Alith was summoned to a strategy meeting. In that strategy meeting, he recognized an old face, a prince by the name of Analtain. Now, Analtain was a prince who had led some Illyrian cavalry some 25 years ago now that helped save Alith and his first scouting unit that he was ever put in charge of. So it was good to see a familiar face. Then the strategy meeting kicked off. They had encountered the force of Druchii with some 40,000 infantry and 10,000 knights. They were outnumbered by about 10,000 by the Druchii. They were outnumbered by about 10,000 by the Druchii army. They did have twice the amount of cavalry. Alith, however, points out that you cannot judge Anlek cavalry by their number. These are trained knights of Anlek. They're heavily armored. They're really a kind of shock cavalry. You shouldn't judge them by your standards of lightweight, fast cavalry. And he said, no, that's fine, but we have bows. They'll never catch us. We'll skirmish them to death. So the conversation kind of moves on to the broad strategy. So what do we do in this situation? Do we continue on our way? Do we fight them in the open field? Or do we run? So there are some options here in terms of what they actually do as an overall strategy, where they even engage this Druchii army. They are still quite near their capital of Torelia, so much so that if they moved around the Druchii army, the Druchii would go and attack the capital. So they say, we have to stay, we have to fight them, because they're going to attack the capital and all our people will be killed. Alith simply chirps up with why, to looks of surprise and shock all around the rest of the strategy table. Alith simply argued an alternative route. He genuinely thought they couldn't win the battle, and he said, look, evacuate your main city, don't fight them here, they have superior troops, and they're more motivated to kill than you guys are. Alith suggested an ambush. Let's set up an ambush for them, we evacuate, they'll maybe follow the evacuees, we set an ambush, that's a way we can take them. The Illyrian said, no, this isn't any good. In an ambush in a wooded area, our cavalry superiority would be of no use. And then Alith just loses patience. He's a man much angrier than he used to be, understandably so, but he just chirps up with, if you do not wish my counsel, why did you ask me here? One of the members of the strategy meeting just chirps up with, and who are you to tell us any better? A dispossessed prince? A wanderer with nothing but hate in his heart? Alith did everything to control striking this imbecile, and simply replied, if you would suffer the same fate as I, then do as you guys are planning. Then you'll see what it's like to be a dispossessed prince with nothing but hate in your heart. Unless you crush the Druchii, kill every last one of them, they will not relent, for they fear Marathi more than they fear your spears. Is it in your noble heart to butcher and kill every last Druchii so that they will not return? At this point, the princess, who Alith has a super crush on, just chirps up with, Alith, we've talked about this before. Darkness cannot be defeated with darkness. Alith, even though she's his main crush at the moment, is just impatient and hate-filled, and simply replies, you fools. I will not take part in this folly. I will not fight in this battle. And he just leaves the tent and goes back to the main encampment where the Nagarothi had set themselves up. Now, the battle was going to proceed with or without Alith's help, the Illyrians had decided, and the battle lines had formed up. The encampment of the Nagarothi ended up being towards the southern end of the battle line, and Alith, with all of his men, were not lined up with the rest of the army. They were not going to partake. It's at that moment, in the distance, on the horizon, as the Druchii army approached, that he spotted it. The dragon. Casting a shadow over the enemy army, he recognized it immediately. This was the dragon, and must be the dragon rider that had killed his father, that had annihilated the army of the Anars at the Battle of Dark Fen, where his father had fallen. This day, vengeance would be his. As Alith got up from his seat, overlooking the battle, and simply said, shadows to me. As the rest of the Nagarothi refugee army geared up for war, Alith stood in front of them. Today, I will lead the shadows again. The enemy bring their own darkness, and that suits us fine. Show no mercy. Every arrow brings death. Every sword thrust, vengeance. Every drop of blood is owed to us. We will be the nightmares once more, and the Druchii will remember why they fear the shadows. This was greeted with cheers of Alith, 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 as the true Nagarothi went to war. Alith took command of the shadows. He led some 200 shadows, and the rest of the refugee forces would line up on the southern flank of the Illyrian battle line and help in the general fight. With the shadows, Alith flanked around the entire line of the Druchii, ending up in behind them. Their movement was mainly hidden with the use of tall grasses that littered the plain of the battle. Now the dragon kept high, and Alith remembered that the dragon only joined the fray at the battle that killed his father, when it was very clear that his side were losing. At this, Alith drew the conclusion that the rider must be some kind of coward, and would probably try and stay mostly out of range unless the battle looked very dire. As Alith moved from one patch of grass to the other, he kept his eye always on the dragon. So, he gave his men the order, look, first thing we're going to do is start taking out these weapon machine crews who were in the back of the enemy battle line. He split his shadows into teams of 5 to 10 and said, look, just kill them all, cut the bowstrings, they have artillery superiority, we will take that advantage away from them. And so the shadows got about their murderly work and started taking down weapons team after weapons team, killing them in silence and moving on to the next war machine. Eventually, however, one of the crew survived and managed to raise the alarm. A regiment turned towards where most of the shadows had been moving through the tall grasses and started to march towards them. They were heavily armored troops, and in hand-to-hand combat, the shadows had no chance. They were also joined by a sorceress who was starting to gather the winds of magic around her, no doubt for a devastating spell. Alith hollered at all the shadows to retreat, and retreat they did, beyond the range and beyond the care of this regiment who had turned to face them. But their work had mostly been done. They had taken out just over half the enemy's war machine, and without artillery superiority, the Druchii army were forced to march forward. Alith kept an eye closely on how the battle developed, all the while making sure to pay attention to the movements of the dragon. As he figured, the dragon only swooped down to give orders intermittently, and then would rise back up into the sky. If he was going to take this dragon rider's life, he had to think of a good way of doing it. The two armies steadily approached one another and eventually came into archery fire, and arrows rained down on both sides. Alith at that point knew, distracted and now engaged in combat, it was time to move again, and this time he ordered take out the sorceresses, and on the way if you see any officers, take them out as well. We will cripple this army from the outside. And so they started to work their way from the southern edge of the battle line to the north, all the while targeting sorceresses. Arrows flew into the throats of officers, taking down any sergeants, anyone of rank they could find. They took advantage of any opportunity they could, hit and run, hit and run. By the time they reached the north end of the battlefield, they had partially crippled the entire command structure of the Druchii army. The shadows had not made it through unscathed, however. Some 30 shadows had failed to meet up at the northern side of the battlefield. Now, on the northern side of the battlefield, the Illyrian army itself has gotten into a bit of trouble. It was being pushed back against a river on the northern side of the battlefield. Trapped by spearmen, a unit of cavalry were coming round the side, looking to take advantage and close the noose around a large section of the Illyrian army. Now, Alith had to think fast to save this huge section of the Illyrian army. This regiment of some 600 cavalrymen were moving quickly, so he grabbed a war horn and blew it as hard as he could, over and over and over again. It managed to distract the attention of the Druchii cavalry, who turned to face the shadows and started to charge towards them. Alith had to search for cover, and across the riverbank he spotted a woodland. Alith knew they stood a chance against this cavalry hunting them if they could only make it to the woodland, so they ran for the river. The cavalry quickened its pace, seeing the shadows break their cover and head towards the river, so they started to charge towards it. The last of the shadows had just managed to get beyond their range within the wide river and begin to swim across by the time the cavalry arrived on the banks. Up and down the river, the cavalry searched for a place to cross. Alith knew from his scouting of the land that there was a place to cross about a half-mile to 3/4 of a mile downstream, and that's the direction the cavalry had started to head in. They'd done nothing but buy themselves time, and he hoped him and his team could run across to the woods on the other bank in time before the cavalry could catch up with them. Having made the swim across the fast-flowing river, the shadows were exhausted on the riverbank. They all slowly rose to their feet as they had to try and start to run to the woodland. The cavalry had started to cross the river, and they had to move if they were going to make it to the tree line in time to survive the assault of the cavalry. Running through the open field, Alith kept an eye as the cavalry rounded the corner. They were only some 250 yards away now, as he started to see deeper into the tree line of the woodland ahead, and that's when he froze in his steps. Alith saw moving around between the trees the telltale signs of the crow messengers, the shadow messengers of the god of fate and destiny, Moraheg. He knew that these must be the messengers that had hunted him until he reached the safe haven of Illyrian. They had come back, the ones that had survived the charge of the Illyrian cavalry. Now he was trapped. There was nowhere to go, and in his desperation, Alith let out a bout of just manic laughter as he could see fate closing in around him. In a brief moment of reason, he reached back to check his quiver for the fight ahead to find he only had one last arrow left. 150 yards away now, the cavalry was charging down. The shadows had all noticed the crow messengers in the tree line as well, and had frozen in place. Taking their lead off Alith, they all turned to face the cavalry. They were going to die now, one way or the other, and so they would meet this Druki cavalry head-on and take some vengeance, some blood owed to them in their deaths. 100 yards away now, the thundering hooves of the cavalry came ever closer. What were the crow messengers waiting for? Why had they not charged the shadows yet? Alith didn't know, and at this point didn't care. He was just preparing to live the next few moments. Then 50 yards. The cavalry came closing in when suddenly, crashing into their flank, the cavalry of the crow messengers charged into the Druki. This was not the group of messengers who had hunted Alith and his party through the woods and into Illyrian. This was his old friend, the messenger who had been with him for the last 25 years, giving him tips of fate on and off. He had brought those who were aligned against Morathi to come to the aid of the Illyrians and to Alith himself. Now Alith knew they had a chance. Charge, shadows! As him and his shadow warriors charged to join the melee. The leading riders of the cavalry hadn't been halted by the attack from the crow messengers, and the first lance darted towards Alith's head. He ducked it and grabbed the front of the saddle of the rider, using the momentum to haul himself up and land seated just behind the rider, stabbing him in the back and allowing him to drop out of the saddle dead. Alith did a cool backflip off the horse as the dead rider got his foot caught in the stirrups and was being dragged along by his unguided horse. Alith turned quickly, and a second rider was about to charge him down. Alith, with all the elven grace he could muster, dived between the legs of the horse, using a knife to cut the bottom of the saddle underneath the horse and cause the rider to fall. The rider landed right beside Alith as Alith stabbed the rider in the eye through the visor of his helm as he lay on the ground next to him. Alith rejoined the fight, and together with the crow messengers, the shadows were victorious in that skirmish. Now, with the crows and the shadows mopping up the rest of the dead, Alith turned his attention to the rest of the battlefield. The dragon and its accursed rider who had killed his father were pouring flame upon the battle and charging down the Illyrian riders. The huge talons of the dragon grasping up 4 or 5 riders at a time and slicing them apart in its grip. Then he noticed a shimmer of golden armor. He knew this was the Princess Athiel, and he had to save her. He grabbed the nearest riderless horse and charged into battle recklessly, leaving the rest of his men behind. He could hear his old friend, I suppose at this point, the Crow Messenger, shout to him, "What difference will you possibly make, Alith?" as he charged headlong at a dragon mounted only on his horse. He was going to get his vengeance and save his princess. As Alith galloped at full stride across the battlefield, he turned his attention to the south, where the rest of his Nagarothi army was securing the battle line. And there, he almost stopped dead in his tracks as, to his amazement, he saw rank upon rank of reinforcement coming in. This looked like the armies of Calador. The newly anointed Phoenix King, once called Imric, had now taken up the name Calador and was leading his forces. The most stunning sight of all was 4 dragons flying low to the ground, so low in fact that it said their wingtips touched the tall grass as they tried to hide their approach from the dragon on the battlefield. 2 red and 2 blue dragons swooped in, and Alith let out a silent cry of joy as he continued to gallop towards the princess. The black dragon and its rider, Coranian, seemed to have not noticed, delighting in their slaughter of the Illyrian reavers, getting ever closer to the princess herself. Then, 2 of the dragons of Calador swung off to help the battle going on beside the river, and 2 swooped towards the black dragon to make swift work of it. The first dragon rolled to the right and then immediately swung left, throwing off the black dragon as it tried desperately to get back into the air, climbing ever higher. The first dragon's attack with its rider's lance had managed to rip the right wing of the black dragon in 2, and now the black dragon was struggling to stay aloft. The second rider had continued to fly ever higher and was now turning, wings tucked in, as its rider and dragon hurtled downwards towards the black dragon, striking it straight in the chest with an enormous lance, causing an explosion of magic and fire as the rider who had killed his father fell from the skies. The dragon, crippled, its right wing badly damaged, and having lost its rider, raked at the other dragons as they clawed at each other's faces and bodies. The black dragon managed to twist, turn away, and begin to flee in the direction of the inner sea of Ulthuan. The rider continued to fall towards the ground, and inevitably to his death. With 4 dragons on their side, the army made quick work of the rest of the Druchii with their general dead. Everyone else was in celebratory mood as fires roared and drinking was had and songs and poetry sung all around the camp. Alith, however, was in a bitter mood. Now, with the Phoenix King's army arriving, many of the troops who were able went on with him and they rode north to continue the war. However, some stayed behind, including Alith and his army of Nagarothi, because they'd been severely battered during the battle. On the southern edge of the battlefield, his troops who weren't the Shadows had suffered serious casualties, if not just many injuries, and they needed to rest up and were in no position to continue further war. So Alith and his troops made camp near the capital of Illyrian, and that is where they stayed for a good time longer. Now, the Princess and Princess of Illyrian also stayed there, one presumes in order to protect their homeland, giving some troops off to the Phoenix King to take on his campaign. After a while, sort of living like this, still in Illyrian, Alith was summoned to the palace. His troops had kind of had a chance to heal up, but he was summoned to the palace to speak with the Prince of Illyrian. Now, Finidel, who was the Prince of Illyrian at the time, just came out and really sat and had a private discussion with Alith, and he just came out and straight up said it. Alith, you love my sister. I know you love my sister, and I'm pretty sure she loves you too. But here's the deal, Alith. You are a hateful git. You're consumed by hatred, and that's going to lead you into war and conflict, and you're going to take my sister that way with you. Now, if you can sit here and promise me that you will give up your quest for revenge, your ongoing hatred for the Druchii, your endless quest for violence against them, then I will happily let you marry my sister. You guys can be together. You can make a go of it. Really, you'd have my blessings. But if you can't look me in the eye today and make me that solemn vow on your word, Alith, that you will no longer seek vengeance for the ill fortune that befell your family, then I'm going to have to ask you to leave my sister alone. Now, this is really a huge moment of self-reflection for Alith, and he really pauses. He doesn't actually know. He does love this woman, but he can't forgo his vow of vengeance. He needs it. That's driving him more than anything. It's the only thing that gets him up in the morning. And he's torn between his love of this woman and his need for hatred and vengeance. But after some time, Alith considered, and he paused, and in his heart, he decided to live life this way, and that love would not be a part of Alith's future, as he turned away from the prince and began to walk out of the palace of Toralia. On his way out, he bumped into the beautiful princess Athiel. Without saying a word, he walked past her, got on his horse, and rode off. While he was passing the palace gates, he forced himself not to look back, as he kicked his heels into his horse and broke into a gallop, riding away, trying to escape his heartbreak. For many days, Alith continued to travel north. He didn't stop back at the camp of the Nagarothi. He just kept going, riding for day after day, mile after mile, foot after foot. He continued north. Eventually, he reached the lands of Avalon. The trees were tall, massive, and ancient in the land of Avalon. This was in fact said perhaps to be the birthplace of the elves themselves, blessed by the goddess Isha. Alith, in the woods, heard a howl of wolves off to his right. Somehow drawn to the sound and wanting to see what it was, he followed the noise to find himself at one edge of a river with the noise coming from the other. Alith dismounted and started to wade into the river. Eventually the river was too deep and he had to start to swim across, leaving his quiver, bow, and sword back with his horse as he made his way across. Now, a normal elf would have probably avoided the howl of wolves, but Alith was being drawn to them, he knew not why. As Alith made his way close to the sound, he saw a dart of white flash across his vision. It was the white stag, one he hadn't seen since he was a boy in the lands of Alandra. He thought the white stag was a sign from Kurnos. This would be a guiding light, and he had to follow it. So he set off, giving chase to the stag. Now, the wolves' howls had started to close in around Alith. He heard howls off to the left, answered by howls on his right, as it was obvious the wolves too were hunting down this white stag as they all ran through the forest. Alith still couldn't see any of the wolves, but he could hear them getting closer and closer. Eventually he broke into a clearing with the white stag panting and exhausted in front of him. The wolves broke out of the tree line to his right and to his left, and then suddenly a voice behind him in the language of Kurnos spoke and said, "The two legs is lost." And this was the voice of one of the huge wolves behind him. These were indeed the biggest wolves he had ever seen, and through his gifts of the language of Kurnos, Alith has in the past been able to speak to certain animals, and it seems these wolves were no exception. "Our hunt," the wolf said to him as a follow-up. Alith turned to face the wolf as he realized he was outnumbered. "My hunt," Alith replies. "Stag is mine. Follow long time." Don't know why he speaks broken English to the wolf, but there we go. Maybe that's the only way they can communicate. "Your hunt? No fangs, no hunt," the wolf replied. Alith drew out his hunting knife, which he had kept sheathed on his belt, and held it in front of him. "One fang, sharp fang. Sharp fang, yes. We, many fangs. Our hunt, our prey." Now at this point, Alith is just straight up in a dissing competition with a massive wolf and a whole pack behind it. But you know, Alith's a pretty ballsy character, so he keeps going and snaps, "My hunt." He quickly ran up to the deer, wrapped his left arm around its neck, and drove his dagger straight through its heart. The wolves erupted into noise. Howls, growls, and barks erupted all around Alith. Alith just stood up and said, "One fang, sharp fang," as he grabbed the stag by the antlers and started to drag the animal towards the wolves. "Plenty food, our kill." The wolf leader seemed to stop as it faced off against Anar, its muscles bunching as about ready to lunge. It eyed the dead deer and then Alith's knife and simply agreed, our kill, as it launched into tearing the stag apart. A couple of days later, we rejoin Alith waking up in a morning completely naked in the wolf den. He has given himself over to the life of the wolf, living with the pack, getting a new appreciation for the bare necessities of life, and leading a very sparse lifestyle, going hunting with them with his one dagger, cutting down game, sharing it with the wolves, and really having a jolly old time, forgetting about his heartbreak back in Illyrian, and his heartbreak and hatred for the Druchii at the loss of his family. Speaking with the wolves, he'd learned that another pack had been roaming through, and after some deliberation, he discovered that this was the Druchii armies moving through Avalon, and he decided to join the wolves in traveling east to have a look at this Druchii army moving through the forests of Avalon. So he spent a lot longer with the wolves, living as one of them, learning the tricks of their hunt, learning the way they kill and eat and live together. Eventually, they found the Druchii encampment, and Alith killed off one of the guards, put on his uniform, and decided to have a wander through camp. Now, seeing the horrors in the Druchii camp, this war was still going on, he kind of came to his senses to a degree. He knew he couldn't live out the rest of his life with these wolves, and what had now been a couple of weeks trying to escape his own heartbreak, Alith decided that he had to go back. He also realized he'd made a terrible mistake bringing his pack here. There were cubs amongst the pack, and this Druchii army was slaughtering everything within range to feed themselves. And so he knew he had to get out of there quickly, and there was one thing he wanted to explore before he returned to the war effort. He asked the wolves about something they'd mentioned in their travels together, an ancient weapon said to be as old as the forest, known as Longfang. He asked them about it, and they took him to a lake. As soon as his head went underneath the surface, he felt like there was no longer any motion or time. His mind flashed to an age before recognition, an age of the gods, and a story unfolded in front of him, the story of the love between Lilith, the goddess of the moon, and Kurnos, the god of the hunt. It said that Lilith and Kurnos could not be together, but that one day she asked the god Vol, the god of smithy in the elven pantheon, to come up and help her forge a gift that she would impart some of her soul and some of her love for Kurnos into, and that Vol could take back to Kurnos to give to him, so that he would always know she is thinking of him. Vol agrees to make this gift for her and proceeds to return to Earth. Now on the way, Cain, the god of murder, worshipped very much by Morathi and the Druchii, intercepted Vol and tortured him, and despite the fact he told him the truth that Lilith had not given him the present take back to Earth, but instead she herself had hidden it away for Kurnos to find without Cain intercepting it. But Cain tortured Vol all the same. Now this gift is said to be the Longfang that Alith is looking for, and that to try and signal to where this is, Lilith shines her light upon it every night, and the wolves, the children of Kurnos, howl their love towards the moon. And that's when Alith comes to. He's in the middle of this still lake with a perfect reflection of the full moon in the middle of the lake. Down, directly beneath him, he saw a glimmer, and he dived down, going deeper and deeper into the darkness, till his lungs were bursting and his muscles ached. But reaching through the mud, he found it, clasped his hands around it, and swam for the surface, desperate to take in any breath he could. And finally, he broke the surface, gasping for air, clinging in his hand a beautiful silver bow. Alith described it as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Silvery metal with a string finer than a single hair. Crescent moons adorned each end as he held the bow above his head once he hit the shore, and the wolves howled in celebration. Alith was amazed at the power of the moon bow. It was so light he could balance it on a single finger, but the projectiles it shot emerged with tremendous power. As he made his way through the forest, he came upon a Druchii knight covered in mud and blood from his previous victim. and decided this night would be his first prey with his new weapon. As he drew the bow for the first time, he could feel the bow beat with his own heartbeat. The strings offered no resistance, and he could swear it was whispering encouragement into his soul. As he let go of the arrow, it flew off the string with such force that it pierced straight through the knight that had been chasing him. When discussing what to do with his wolf pack, they wanted to go to the court of the Everqueen, which was defensible, so Alith agreed, and hoping they could make a stand against this Druki army moving through the forest. However, when they got to the border of the territory of the court of the Everqueen, the trees seemed to close in around them and eventually surrounded Alith and his pack. Off to his right, one of the trees shuddered as it started to seemingly break apart, but it was not. It was a tree man waking, and he began to converse with Alith and the pack. "Alith, last of the Anars, the wolves are welcome here, but not you. There is a darkness within you. Darkness is drawn to you, and you to it, and so you cannot pass." Alith sort of pauses and understands that he still has all that hatred in his heart, and he has to turn away and let the wolves go to safety for fear of the Druki who are going through the forest burning and killing anything in their path will kill these wolves if they come upon them. So Alith agrees and decides to leave, and he makes the tree man promise him that he won't let the wolves follow. A path opens up through the trees, Alith darts through it, and it closes behind him, to the mournful howls of the wolf pack who did not want to give up Alith and would have joined him on his trek across the woods. Alith, on foot now, alone again, ran for days back towards Illyrian, back towards what was left of his people. And as he ran, blessed by the vigor of the Lord of the Hunt himself, he became possessed by a new idea, his new vision for war. As a pack, his shadows would hunt, moving in darkness, killing together. That was going to be their creed from now on. When he eventually arrived at the Nagarothi camp, he looked ridiculous, covered in mud, completely naked. He just walks in, having run what was many days' ride away, back to the camp of the Nagarothi. Now, as he arrived in camp, many of the leaders of the Nagarothi were gathered around a certain area. He joined them, many to sort of shocks and gasps, as he pottered through the camp naked and unashamed. And this is when he realized that a herald of the Phoenix King was there, and he had summoned the leader of the Nagarothi to come and meet with him. Alith simply chirped up with, "I am not some hound to be called to heel. I will fight the Druki in the way I see fit, and will suffer no interference or questions." As he turned to the herald, "Protect Ulthuan and its people, but know this, Nagaroth is mine." "By what right?" the herald asked. "The cold of winter runs in my veins. The legacy of Anarian beats in my heart. I do not seek it for myself, but keep it free from the ambitions of others." The herald kind of chuckled at this in a slightly frightened way and said, You owe loyalty to no one? You would make yourself king, yet rule over a barren waste and have no subjects? You will become a king of nothing, a king of shadows." Alith remembered then what he had been called the first time he'd met the messenger of Moraheg when he was still a boy. He remembered being referred to as the one who would be called the king in the shadows. And he simply turned and said, "Yes, that is exactly what I will become." Some of the scurrying leadership around went to get Alith some clothes, to dress him and to make him not look like a crazy wild man who just wandered into camp, and he simply turned to them with his new idea. And he turned to all his troops and said, "We will fight them where it hurts. We will go home and fight them in Nagaroth. It will be years before Kalador is ready to end this threat once and for all. In that meantime, the Druki will destroy everything." Now, the herald's still here, even though he's talking to the leadership. And the herald says, "You will see us all become shadows." Just thinking like, we're all going to die if you don't do anything. If you don't help us here, Alith. What are you doing? You can't go off on your own. And he says, "Yes, I would see us all become shadows." With that, the herald kind of wanders off, and Alith decides to turn to his troops once again and says, "The land of our home, Naggareth, will become a place that the Druchii fear. Every drop of blood we give, we will claim a river back. We will retrain our troops, borrow weapons from Illyrian, and I will ask a lot from each and every one of you. Those of you who cannot keep up, who cannot fight this method of war, should stay behind." This was a new type of warfare for the elves. Each one of the old shadows from the original raid and Anlek was given 50 men under them to train to become shadows in their own right, and these men would each be titled Shadow Walkers as their rank. They had 2 years to get ready, and in 2 years their war would begin, the Shadow War. Over the course of the 2 years, the Naggarothi warriors trained tirelessly. They worked on their archery, their stalking skills. They lived in the wilderness with no supplies or support, simply living off the land. Alith taught them the language of Kurnos, so they could summon hawks and use them as messengers between the different groups. They would learn to turn dead wood into fire, and they operated in independent groups. Alith wanted them kept apart, like rival packs of wolves, never overlapping territories and unaware of each other's movements. Alith himself would go from group to group, training where he could, and for a large part, preaching his message of vengeance, reminding each of the Naggarothi of everything they'd lost at the hands of the Druchii, and how, with every drop of Druchii blood shed, their loved ones, their lost ones would be avenged, and they would be the bringers of justice to Naggareth. This served two purposes: to both motivate and to enable a type of savagery, to think of the Druchii as less than themselves, to enable them to do the dirty work that lay ahead. By the time the 2 years was over, they were ready. On the cusp of winter, their campaign of terror began, and just overnight the camp was cleared out of the warriors, and the Illyrians had no idea where they were going, what they were doing. They just disappeared overnight. They started by taking down fortresses leading back into Naggareth, and then they led countless ambushes where storms of black-shafted arrows rained down upon Druchii patrols. High-ranking officials and officers were targeted. Camps would wake up with their entire command structure slaughtered in the night, but they didn't stop there. They went on to slaughter the officers' families, their next of kin, their friends, anyone they could get a hold of. Bodies of Druchii were found in the morning, hanging from trees, their entrails strewn about the branches. They were found pinned to doors with messages on them. Many of the corpses had the elven runic symbol for vengeance carved upon their flesh somewhere. They would send out scouts to try and track down the shadows, only to have the scouts return dead, tied onto their horses with their eyes and mouths sewn shut, and rose thorns tying their hands to the saddle. The Druchii would never see these attackers. They would take their arrows, they would take any bodies of their fallen. They were like ghosts, and soon the idea of the shadows being supernatural spread across the Druchii ranks. Alith used this to gain further advantage, getting his shadow warriors to start to howl and make noise in the dark, allow the enemy brief glimpses of a cloak here and there before any ambush, just to cause terror in their hearts before they died. The shadow walkers, the veterans of the shadow warriors, learnt to harness new skills. They'd learnt to use their magics to dim campfires, to add to the sense of terror and aid their cover when attacking Druchii encampments. The Druchii during this campaign died by their hundreds, screaming in terror. Each new dawn brought fresh pillars of smoke from a burnt-out caravan, a stormed encampment, some horror that had befallen Druchii troops the night before and could be seen by others for miles around. As a whole, the campaign was not all just screams and terror. Alith was also set on freeing the Naggarothi, who were either still loyal to the idea of Malekith or were just against the perversions of Morathi. And so many of these guys were hostages. He would free them, or the Shadow Warriors would free them, and they would also help out with any spare supplies they had to give away to the local communities, helping them in their resistance effort. Now, the Shadow Warriors all made sure to let the people know that this aid was on behalf of the Shadow King. And so soon word of the Shadow King and the Shadow Warriors spread to not only terrify all Druchii within Nagaroth, but also to the wider Ulthuan, giving them hope of the struggles ahead. Towards the end of winter, the Druchii had had enough. They dedicated an entire army to tracking down Alith and his troops under the leadership of Confaris. Now, Confaris is a character that has popped up briefly, although we haven't called him by name earlier in the story. He is in fact the father of Ashneel, Alith's once fiancée, who he now realized after many years never truly loved him. Now he knew what love was, through the maid he dealt with when he was undercover in Tiranoc, to the princess of Illyrian, who he'd also fallen in love with and whom loved him back. He knew what the real thing was, and Ashneel was a faker doing her duty under her father's commands, and he'd come to terms with this. But now knowing that this army, under the guidance of this once ally of House Anar who had turned against them, was leading the hunt for him, Alith took it personally, and he devised a plan. With all the Druchii troops out of Tiranoc, no longer guarding its borders or its palaces, mostly looking for him around the country, and with his different cells of shadow warriors, they had very little chance of actually catching them. He sent out the Hawks to summon the most veteran of the Shadow Warriors to him, for he now had an opportunity to attack Tiranoc itself. He was going to make sure that the Druchii knew he could strike them anywhere, even in the heart of an occupied city. Having summoned his most capable shadows to him, Alith's plan was obviously not one of pure force. A small, elite troops were going to sneak into Tiranoc, and that's exactly what they did. They got into the throne room, and there, sitting on a throne from the shadows, Alith watched the father of his once fiancée issue orders and edicts, and just waiting for him to finish his day. As he started to head back towards his bedchamber, Alith emerged from the shadows. Alith, the Druchii said, recognizing him, and for the first time knowing the true nature of the Shadow King was once this boy he had promised his daughter to. Could call the guards, Alith, you are a dead man. Alith stopped him by holding his hand out in front of him. If you call the guards, I will simply disappear. Your only hope of catching me and ending the work of the shadows as you see it will be to beat me yourself here and now. The Druchii, however, was unarmed. This is not very honorable, Alith. No, it's not, Alith replied. I find the honorable tend to lose. As Alith reached back, pulled out the moon bow, and pulled an arrow from his quiver. He pulled back the bow with no resistance and let loose, catching this traitor to the Anars in his left eye. Alith then casually walked up to the body and sliced off its head, putting it in a bag and walking away. Just at the doorway, though, he paused, turned round, walked back, and kicked the corpse, then left the chamber. His next target was going to be the man who had betrayed his own princedom of Tiranoc, the man who many years ago Alith had served under the guise of being a steward, and who had, in fact, through his idiocy, given away Tiranoc to the Druchii. Alith, to cause a distraction, if not just the destruction of the palace itself, began to walk the halls with a torch, setting the palace ablaze. Then he asked, one presumes his shadow warriors, although this is not confirmed, to grab his old master out of the bedchamber posing as servants and guide him outside into the gardens. They do this, and there Alith is waiting in the shadows, unseen. Do you have any regrets? He asked his old master, who had given away one of the great princedoms of Ulthuan. Where? What? Who are you? Where am I? Who is this? What's going on? Said the baffled idiot. How about your conscience? How does that feel with so many deaths on your hand? Alith tried again. I was tricked, says the foolish noble. They tricked me, the Druchii. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Where are you? Who am I speaking to? Show yourself. Do you feel guilty? Asked Alith again. Yes, yes I do. Every night I'm haunted by what I have done. I know I was foolish, short-sighted, I meant no harm, hollered the Lord into the darkness. And what act of contrition would you perform to make amends? Anything, oh gods, anything. I would do anything to put this right. Alith pulled his dagger from his belt and threw it at the feet of his old master. What should I do with that? He asked, staring at the knife imbecilically. You know what to do. I suggest slitting your throat would be quickest. What if I refuse? Said the nobleman as he kicked the knife away. Then, with almost supernatural speed, Alith went from the shadows to behind his master, putting a black-gloved hand over his mouth and stabbing him in the back. After a few moments of struggle, the traitor fell limp in Alith's arms. Alith then cut off his head, thinking to himself he would have spared the elf this indignity if only he'd had the courage to do the right thing and take his own life for the treachery he had brought upon Ulthuan and all the lives he had cost. Then Alith, with the 2 bags, set off on his way with his most elite shadows following behind. That morning, along the road to the capital of Tiranoc, 2 spears held aloft the head of the master of the Druki and the nobleman of Tiranoc who had allowed them to take over. One with a crest of vengeance carved into his forehead, the other with the crest carved into his cheek. Following the beheading of the leadership of Tiranoc, Alith's campaign of terror continued. But there were rumors abound that Morathi had lost patience and had summoned one of the family's most trusted generals from across the sea. Now, if you guys have watched my Helbron video, which I do recommend you do, it's slightly linked to this, in the top right hand corner, you'll know that this man was Alandrian, the father of Helbron herself. So he is a very competent general, and he begins to lead an army on the hunt for Alith and the Shadows. From one of the villages that Alith had been dealing with, had been helping out, he got some intelligence that the leaders of the cults, of each respective cult, were traveling from Anlek, moving out to a safer location away from the capital, because the raid on Tiranoc had taught the Druki that even their cities weren't safe. Alith, thinking that they had to hit this caravan, if they could wipe out the leadership of the cult, it would greatly affect Morathi's control over her entire army. This was a must-hit target, and as such, he summoned a large portion of the Shadow Warriors to his side to fight off what must be a truly well-guarded caravan transporting these cult leaders from one place to the other. Now, Alith knew the route of the caravan, and he'd had his scouts tracing it for the last sort of half day. He set up his ambush along a coastal road, and he knew that their caravan would be led here into a dead end where these shadows could take advantage and slaughter them all. The caravan came into sight over the horizon. Alith almost licked his lips in anticipation of the bloodshed ahead. But then, from the further cries of the battlefield, messages started reaching Alar of troops incoming. There was wave upon wave of Druki regiment coming from both sides, pinning them against the cliff face. Alith did not have many options. They could make a sprint for it and just go to try and cross the road upon which they've been set up away from the sea and try and make a break inland. However, if they went across the road, the ones leading the regiments were mounted knights who would run them down if they tried to make it across the road. Alith thought to himself, this was a perfect trap with the perfect bait. This new general, the rumors must be true, is much more adept than the ones I beheaded. Perhaps that was a mistake in retrospect. Now they were out of options, and the knights and every other regiment were closing in. They had no choice but to stand their ground and fight as best they could. Alith ordered his shadows, aim for wherever you can, holes in the armor, take down the horses if you need to. Whatever it takes, we must survive. Arrows started to fly as the Druki regiments came into range. The shadows were firing as they retreated towards the sea to their back. Alith's moonbow was causing devastation, going through the neck of one knight and hitting the one behind, just causing huge amounts of casualties. It was not enough. There were too many of them. For every one they felled, it seemed like two took his place. It was a battle they couldn't win, and so they continued to retreat, thinking that at least they'll take their chances with the cliff face to their backs and diving into the sea, rather than have to face down this army of heavily armored Druki. Now, when they got to the cliffs, their hearts sank. There were 3 Druki battleships waiting in the cliffs below to pick off any survivors. Already, some of the shadows had dived in, with arrows from these ships flying into the sea, their blood starting to turn the water red. But there was no choice. They would kill them all, so Alith gave the order, and all the shadows began to dive off the cliff into the ocean below. As Alith crashed into the sea, his arm felt like it hit something on the ocean floor, maybe a rock or something else. He'd done damage to himself. Now the sea was chaos of frothing, panicked elves being struck down. Salt water, tainted with the taste of blood, filled Alith's mouth as he broke the surface. This seemed to be it. He would either die to a bow or he would be drowned. Then the army on the cliff face had started to reach the edge of the cliff, and they too added their fire from the top of the cliff to try and kill the shadows who had dived into the ocean below. Alith and the others had no choice but to try and swim, escape in different directions, just run. There would be heavy casualties, but maybe some would make it out. Alith swam as though his life depended on it. All the time, arrows hitting to the left of him, to the right. He didn't know he'd get a kick in the face from a fellow swimmer. It was sheer panic, but eventually he got clear, made it to shore, and then just began to run. The shadows already had a regrouping point assigned to them if the ambush failed, and that's the direction in which Alith headed. His heart was heavy, however, as he thought of all of the shadow warriors he had lost this day, for even now, he had no idea how many had survived the slaughter of this trap. When they managed to get back to camp, Alith had sort of got an assessment of the casualties, and they'd lost over 100 fighters. Now, in all of their campaigns so far, they'd lost less than a dozen warriors in all of their confrontations, and this was a heavy burden to bear for such a small but elite fighting force. Alith then got on to his shadow warriors and just said to them, "Look, if you believe I have steered you wrong, feel free to leave at this stage. But I'm not gonna stop. I'm not gonna let this beat me. If we don't strike again now," while they pat themselves on the back and congratulate themselves for this heavy loss that we have suffered, then we may as well call it quits. So I'm gonna hit them back, and we're gonna keep going, no matter what, vengeance or death. And that's when he decides to continue to target the Druki. They're not quite the fighting force they were, but they're still great. They operate in cells, they're still a very high-functioning force, and perhaps they've been neutered a little bit, but they are still a thorn in Morathi's side. A bridge was their next target, which they hit within a few days of the massacre, just announcing to the Druki that they were still there. The next target on Alith's list was a tax house, where Morathi was gathering all her gold, and this would allow them to replenish their supplies, perhaps even allow for some training of some replacement troops, and really serve them well in the campaign to come. Alith and his shadows attack the guards of a tax house, just as the collections have all been made. Now, the guards themselves are not much of a problem, and the shadows finish them off and start to haul the gold onto carts. That's when the weather breaks and it starts to pour rain on them, but they continue their work, that is, until 4 figures emerge out of the fog that had sprung up with the bad weather, not too far away from the tax house. Alith, spotting them, immediately sensed malice and ordered his men inside. Alith could finally make them out. There was a warrior clad in silver armor, most likely a prince of some sort, 2 Canaanite warriors. He couldn't quite make out the 4th figure as his men pushed him back away from the window. Then one of them chirped up with, "That's not good." "What is it?" asked Alith. "Best not look." Not taking this for an answer, Alith forced his way to the window and was haunted by what he saw. There, standing with these other figures out in the rain in front of the tax house, was Ashniel, his once fiancée, the daughter of the man he had just killed, the traitor to House Anar. And so it seemed she had turned as well. He felt the pain of seeing her turning to the side of Morathi like a physical wound on his person. Although, as I said, he'd long since made up his mind that Ashliel did not love him, it did not stop the fact that once upon a time, he did greatly love her. Once he could tear his attention away from Ashliel, he looked back across and could no longer see the two scantily clad Cainite cultist women. They had disappeared, only to re-emerge holding two children from a village nearby. "I want the Shadow King," shouted the armor-clad prince, "or these children will be killed." Alith could not and would not allow innocents to die for him, and started to stand up and walk towards the door. His men, however, pushed down his shoulders to stop him from moving. Then the prince turned and nodded to the Canaanite warrioresses, who slit the throats of the children and dropped them as their blood poured out into the mud. Alith got up and ran towards the door. His men tackled him. "We can't allow this, sir. We'll deal with this. They want the Shadow King. They shall have one." And that is the point at which Alith gets struck from behind in the head and loses consciousness. For as far as we, the audience, are concerned, in the confrontation, one of his men, who dressed as Alith, managed to kill one of the Canaanite warrioresses. Now, these women, as you may know if you've listened to my Helbrun video, were Helbrun and her sister. Helbrun kills the soldier dressed as Alith and claims the Moon Crescent bow as the prize to present back to Morathi. So they take that away, and Helbrun has lost a sister, but her father, and Ashniel are still alive, and they leave the tax house thinking they have killed the Shadow King. But Alith, of course, only heard this story, and if you want a bit more detail on the whole story about what happened, do check out my Helbrun video. You'll find a link in the description below, or you'll find a link at the end of this video. Now, what happens to Alith during this time is a bit of a mystery, but with word that Helbrun had slain the Shadow King, word spread across Ulthuan, across Nagaryth. Word even reached the Shadows, who were not involved in the action that day. So a lot of the Shadows assume that Alith has been killed. As such, they all regroup around the old home of the Anars in Alandra to try and decide what to do next. And without a Shadow King, they're kind of leaderless. They do kind of come up with new leaders, but they decide not to wage an active war. The armies of the Druki have been reinforced from all of the armies of their colonies outside of Ulthuan, and their forces have become overwhelming. Not only that, but the fact that Alith had been tracked down twice in fairly quick succession for him seemed to be that they'd found a way of locating them, and so the Shadows decided to keep a low profile. They patrolled the old land of the Anars and came to start calling themselves the Asanar, the new people of Anar. That's what they named themselves after, and some of them actually settled down, had families, started to just have kind of more normalized lives than being constantly at war. This went on for a full 7 years. The Shadow Warriors would have the occasional skirmish with the Druki, but they tried to keep as low a profile as possible, allowing the Druki to think that the entire Shadow army had been dispersed with the death of Alith. So everyone's kind of a little bit despondent and no one's going to war. But then the leader of the Shadows at the time, a chap by the name of Tharian, I think, or something along those lines, summoned all of the Shadow Walkers, all of the veterans, all of the leaders of the Shadow Warriors to a meeting. In that meeting, they had to discuss a new threat. Morathi had found herself a new general known as the Witch King, and he was tearing armies apart. This was a situation that they maybe had to deal with, try and take him out, or at least compare notes on what they had about this mysterious new figure who had risen to start leading the armies of Morathi. Then, after 7 years, out of the shadows, clad all in black, a stranger approached them and drew down his hood after they challenged him on who he was and what he wanted. He pulled down his hood. "I am the Shadow King, and I want vengeance." Alith had returned. Only a couple of Shadow Warriors knew the truth who had escaped with Alith's unconscious body from the tax house, and he swore them to secrecy. He thought strategically it was best if they lay under cover. If Morathi and the Druchii thought that he was dead, they would no longer be a target, no longer hunted, and they'd be able to strike back with them not being perceived as a threat any longer. He had also decided his warriors needed a little bit of peace and they needed to rebuild, but he was not the man to be able to do that. Those were not his gifts. And he felt that he was the biggest danger, the biggest target, and so withdrew to allow them to rebuild their forces and regain their strength. Before they could return on their campaign of vengeance, however, Alith had one piece of unfinished business he wanted to deal with, so he told his shadows he was off to break into Anlek, the capital of the Druchii, their military center, their main city, and he was going to get his bow back from Morathi. Anlek itself had changed much since the last time Alith had been there. It's much more foreboding, with the Druchii decorating it in their own macabre way. The towers were higher than ever, with silver chains hanging from each of them, each with a dangling corpse on the end of it. Heads were displayed on spikes above the gatehouses and the ramparts of all of the walls, and all round it become a much more gruesome and disgusting locale from the proud fortress it had once been. So Alith, using all his guile and stealth, disguises, climbing walls, all the gifts at his command, he managed to by himself sneak into Anlek. As he wandered the great halls of the palace, dressed appropriately as though he was one of the Druchii, he caught glimpse of the ancient statues that were the heroes of the campaign of Anarion, the founding father of elfdom as it is today. Amongst those lieutenants was, of course, his grandfather. Bloodied nails had been driven into the eyes of his grandfather's statue, and as he caught sight of the statue, he was reminded that his grandfather was said to have been taken alive from his home of Alandra. After all these years, is it possible that he is still here in Anlek, that he may be in the dungeons somewhere? And so Alith begins to sneak down to the dungeons, and he accosts a maid who is down there, mopping out one of the cells, threatens her life, and asks her where Alith Anar is. He's not in here, he's not in the dungeons. They say they keep him up in one of the towers. Alith was a bit befuddled by this. Why would he be up in one of the apartments in the towers? But whatever. He kind of lets go. The woman never saw him. He doesn't kill her. She's just a maid after all. She might raise the alarm, but what are they looking for? A guard? So he just disappears off and goes up to the apartments. He sort of listens out and he finds his grandfather's room. So he goes into his grandfather's room. Alith's grandfather was sitting in a chair basking in the sunlight with his eyes closed. Alith was transported in his mind back to a more innocent time where his grandfather would sit in the sunroom enjoying the warmth of the rising sun. "Grandfather," he whispered as he crouched next to the aging elf. His grandfather stirred, muttering to himself. "Illyrian," Alith said louder, making sure his grandfather could hear. "Who is that?" he asked in a hoarse whisper. "It is Alith, grandfather." "Be gone with your tricks," Illyrian snapped. "Alith is dead. You killed them all. Take your apparitions away." "No, grandfather, it's really me. It's Alith." As Alith laid his hands on his grandfather's and squeezed them gently, "I'm going to get you out of here." "You will not trick me in this way," said Illyrian. "You can blind me. You cannot make a fool of me." "Look at me, grandfather," Alith said. "It is really Alith." Illyrian turned his head and opened his eyes, revealing that his eyes were just now two lifeless orbs. His grandfather, like the statue had depicted, had been blinded. "Do you still take pleasure in your handiwork, demon? I did not give you the satisfaction of my cries when you took my sight, and I will not give you the reward of my dashed hopes now." "I'll find you healers, grandfather," said Alith, tugging on his arm, desperately trying to get him out of the chair. "In Safri, the mages will be able to give you back your eyes. We can do it. We have to go now." "You would like me to leave, wouldn't you, fiend?" said his grandfather. "How many souls did she promise you if I left with you? 1001? Their deaths will not be on my conscience. You threaten me, goad me, tempt me like this, but I will not allow you to seal that infernal bargain. You have to come with me, Alith said. Now tears are pouring down his eyes. He just can't convince his grandfather to leave. Please believe me, it's Alith. We have to go. I do not have to believe anything. It is torture enough that you keep me in this vile place where I can smell the sacrifices and hear their screams. You leave open my door and tell me I can leave any time that I wish, but you know I could never do that. My spirit remains pure, and when I am taken to the afterlife, I shall not be haunted by the shades of elves murdered for my freedom. I would stay here 1,000 years longer and endure whatever torments you can devise rather than allow this to happen. At this point, Alith realized that Morathi had long been torturing, telling him he could leave, but it would cost the lives of thousands of elf hostages they had if he ever walked out the door, but still leaving the door unlocked. Alith stepped back, the shock of the situation, the horror of it all, starting to dawn on him. From sorrow, he moved into rage. He could take his grandfather forcefully, but the old elf would make it impossible to get out of there. Alith unsheathed his knife from his belt, thinking that he would end his grandfather's suffering. His hand started to shake, and he snatched back the blade. He couldn't do it, though it tore him apart to think that his grandfather was suffering so. Alith could only do as he was raised and respect his grandfather's wishes. He bent forward, kissed him on the forehead, and simply said, "Goodbye, grandfather. Die with peace and dignity," as he walked out the room. One more humiliation to be avenged, thought Alith to himself. Using the same way he'd managed to locate his grandfather, he took another servant hostage and managed to locate where the moonbow was being stored. It was being stored in somewhat of a gallery-stroke-trophy room, where the trophies of the Druki War Morathi liked to keep on display. The gallery was mostly empty, but for several soldiers positioned around the display, who looked noticeably bored. Alith loitered in the crowd for a while and noticed some of the horrible things that had been collected. A cloak made from the pelt of a white lion, torn from the back of a Kracian prince. The sun spear, once carried by the Prince of Kafik. Charred bark stripped from the skin of a tree man of Avalon. Alith hid his disgust at the grisly relics on display, pushing his way around the gallery, and then he saw it. On a purple cushion, its once so shiny silvery metal looked dull as it lay there lifeless, with a plaque underneath it that read, "Bow of the so-called Shadow King, slain by Helbron, priestess of Cain." Alith walked up to the warrior who was guarding that display and just whispered to him, "I'll borrow this." His hand moved in a flash, whipped the soldier's sword from his scabbard, and stabbed the soldier with his own blade, giving it a solid twist in the Druki's gut before pulling it free. Chaos erupted all around the gallery. The people started running in every direction. Some tried to grab hold of Alith, but he cut them down savagely, kicking aside their bodies as he charged towards his prize, his moonbow. Some in Alith's path tried to run, but he cared not, and he cut them down as they had their backs turned to him. Reaching his moonbow, he snatched it up, and he felt it spring into life in his grasp. Its warmth swept up his arm as he could hear the chorus of gentle voices hovering on the edge of hearing, whispering their words of encouragement to Alith. Now, guards had begun to surround his position with bared blades. Alith, who was on kind of the second floor of the gallery at this point, leapt over the banister and dropped into the gallery below. Now, something shiny caught his eye at the very sort of apex of the gallery. What it was an ancient relic of his princedom of Nagaryth, and that was a simple band of silver and gold with a gem-studded star upon it. It was the crown of Nagaryth, worn by Anarion and Malekith before him, and Alith would be damned if he let such a thing lay in the hands of filth like Morathi. He swung his sword at approaching guards as he charged towards the crown. On the next guard, he drove a dagger into him with a parchment he'd written earlier, a little note for Morathi, and on it read, "Dear Morathi, not dead yet, bitch? Send your new thug to Alandra if you dare. Signed, Alith Anar, Shadow King." It was signed with the runes of Shadow and Vengeance. Turning deftly from blow, he would parry the next and continue on his way as he sent his sword sliding through Druki's throat. He spun and kicked the next guard who approached him before jumping clean over him and driving a sword through his back. Alith swung with the moonbow to parry the next attack coming in, and with his blade slashed a thin ribbon of blood across the Druki's face. Then, as he got to the crown, "I'll take that as well, thank you very much," as he laughed to himself, slinging his bow over his shoulder. He flipped the crown onto his head, and then ducked underneath the next oncoming sword attack. A kick to the knee sent the soldier tumbling down to his level, which was followed up by a series of blows by Alith to knock the Druki guard down. Alith cut a bloody path of slaughter through the remaining Druki guard as he headed towards the doors of the gallery, hoping against hope that they weren't locked. They weren't. Alith burst out into the hallway, found chaos beyond the doors. Servants and Druki nobles were pushing each other to get out of the way. Guards were rushing in the other direction. And then, out of the corner of his eye in all the chaos, Alith spotted a servant's entrance just beyond the group of oncoming guards. A servant was ahead of him, and he leapt onto the servant's shoulder, jumped onto the walls, and grabbed a banner to swing deftly over the entire cadre of guards that were coming down the hall and land behind them, running towards that entrance. He ran down the stairs of the servant's stairwell, bursting through another set of double doors, and he found himself in a huge reception room with a naked couple of Druki writhing upon each other on the couches in the room. At the far end, he saw an open window, finally some kind of exit. He ran towards it and drove the sword he had in his hand between the shoulder blades of the rutting male Druki, pinning him to the female beneath him and killing them both. He could hear the clatter of armored feet coming in behind him, but he vaulted out the window and onto the rooftops of Anlek. He landed with a roll, slightly twisting his ankle painfully, but he could not stop and continued to run, lowering himself all the time till he reached the walls and then vaulted over them, making his way into the woodland beyond. Alith returned to Alandra, sure he'd managed to motivate Morathi enough to send the Witch King after him. For after all, this was one of the main reasons that Alith returned. This new threat had to be dealt with. He was being too successful on the battlefield, and if he could motivate Morathi to send this so-called Witch King to Elandris, where the Shadow Warriors could deal with him on their own terms, in their own territory, then all the better. And that was really his plan. Now, every day since he got back from Anlek, Alith was expecting death. He was expecting an army to descend upon their position, and that was it. By night, the Shadow Warriors kind of dispersed for safety reasons, but they'd all come together again, prepared to do battle during the day. And then, about 7 days after he'd returned to Elandris, a person arrived on the horizon. It was, in fact, the Crow Messenger, who Alith had had a long relationship with at this point, who had saved his life at the battle with the Illyrians, and who had long since been an advisor of sorts to Alith. Alith approached his old acquaintance and said, "I see it is not only my enemy I have brought out of hiding. The time has come to return this," said the Raven Herald, handing Alith a bound spear shaft. "What is it?" said Alith. He didn't quite recognize it. "Cut free the bindings when the Witch King comes," said the messenger, "and you will see." "Do you know who the Witch King is?" said Alith. The messenger shook his head. "You have far more eyes and ears than I, Alith. Besides, did you not venture into Anlek to find out?" "I got distracted," Alith replied. "I am glad that you are here, though." "There are few of us left," said the Crow Messenger, "and I do not think that the Raven Heralds will survive this war. Our time has passed, Alith." Alith was a little bit sad to hear this, because although there were some on Morathi's side and some on his side and the side of good as he perceived it, they've kind of been a long-standing tradition in Elven society. And Alith thought to himself that he'd been many things to Alith: a guardian, an ally, a companion, but never quite a friend. "The Shadow King can now watch over Nagaroth," said the messenger. "Moraheg gives way to Kurnos and moves all her seeing gaze upon others." Alith couldn't really think of anything to say to this, and so the two of them stood side by side, looking to the west, waiting for the approaching army of Anlek to descend upon them. It wasn't long before the Druchii army could be seen marching along the road, cutting across foothills. A massive ribbon of black stretched along the landscape. Alith scanned the sky, searching for sign of dragon riders or manticores, but there was nothing. It seemed that Alith's plan had succeeded. The Witch King would confront him personally. The sheer number of the army that Morathi had brought to bear was absolutely shocking for the Shadow Warriors. They'd never seen such an army, and no one had an idea that Morathi had assembled so many troops. There was more than 100,000 here, laid out in the battlefield in front of them. Alith, too, was in awe at the sheer number in the army. The army came to an abrupt stop about outside a bolt thrower range. The intent was clear. There was to be some kind of parley here between the Witch King and Alith. Then, whispers started to circulate around the Shadow Warriors, and over the horizon appeared a massive, single, black dragon. As it approached, Alith knew this must be the Witch King. This was by far the largest dragon Alith had ever seen, twice the size of the dragon responsible for killing his father. Alith saw the beast circle over the Shadow Warriors and was about to order their full retreat until he realized that it was just a circle of intimidation. This whole display was about intimidation as the black dragon swooped back towards the lines of the Druchii, landing just in front of the Dark Elf army. A tall figure dismounted, dropping to the ground. The air seemed to shimmer around him. A haze of dark mists like rising heat came from the ground. Alith watched closely as the Witch King approached. He was far taller than any elf he'd seen, clad in an all-encompassing suit of black armor. He carried a massive shield with a gold relief of a hateful rune that burned Alith's eyes when he looked upon it. The sword in his right hand was enveloped by a blue flame from hilt to tip, casting dancing shadows on the snow around him. As this figure drew within 100 paces of Alith, he could see that thin wisps of steam seemed to swirl around the warrior. Realizing with horror that the plates of mail armor smoldered, every joint and rivet still hot as if recently forged. The Witch King left molten snow and scorched earth in his wake, while the air itself recoiled from his presence, steaming away from his body in whirling vortices. Alith had ordered his troops not to attack until he commanded. He needed to know who dared call himself ruler of Naggareth, if not him. Having seen the strength of the Witch King host, he had no doubt that this man was some kind of warrior and commanded a great deal of loyalty in Anlek. As the Witch King came through the old gates of Alandra, Alith's gaze was drawn to his eyes. As the Crow Messenger had told him, he started to cut away the bindings of the spear that had been given to him by the Crow Messenger, that he was told to unbind when he met the Witch King. It was a banner, tattered and stained, ragged with holes with frayed stitches at its edges. It had once been white, but was now a dirty brown and grey, with a design upon it of a golden griffin wing. It was the banner of his house, the banner of House Anar, that fluttered in the wind as the Witch King approached. Alith was emboldened by this fantastic sight, as prepared to face down against this monstrous elf. By what right do you enter these lands without the permission of Alith Anar, Lord of House Anar, Shadow King of Naggareth? Alith demanded, raising the ragged banner above his head. If you come to treat with me, hear my oath to the dead. Nothing is forgotten, nothing is forgiven. The Witch King stopped about a dozen paces away from Alith and sheathed his sword and gestured at the banner with a mere flick of his finger. The standard burst into flames and disintegrated in a flutter of charred flakes, and were quickly swept away by the wind, leaving Alith holding nothing but a burnt staff. He let the smoking wood drop from his fingers. House Anar is dead, grunted the Witch King. His voice was deep, as if it was coming from a distant hall. Only I rule Naggareth. Swear loyalty to me, and your past will be forgotten, your treachery forgiven. I will grant you these lands to rule as your own, your fealty owed only to me. Alith laughed at this. You would make me a prince of graves, a custodian of nothing. By what right do you demand such loyalty? The Witch King took a few more steps forward, and it took all of Alith's courage not to turn tail and run. He could hear strange voices whispering on the edge of his consciousness as the Witch King grew nearer. The heat emanating from his armor was almost unbearable even at this distance. "Do you not recognize me, Alith?" the Witch King said, bending closer to him, his tone quiet. "Will you not serve me once more?" Alith's face dropped into shock. Finally, it all made sense, as recognition crashed upon him like a wave. This was Malekith, Prince of Nagaryth, who had been transformed into this horror, into this Witch King. At this point, so the story goes, that Alith simply replied with a no, and then he signaled to his forces to run. Alith and his forces ran as though their lives depended on it. They had to escape this force of 100,000, and so when Alith retells this story, what we understand is that him and the Shadow Warriors scattered. They ran through the mountains to avoid Malekith's army. Now everything was clear. Malekith and Morathi had been in league. This must have all been some kind of ruse. Malekith had turned against the rest of Ulthuan. Everything was making more and more sense. Now, the idea being that they managed to avoid this huge army because the mountains were, after all, Alith's mountains, and the Shadow Warriors had spent the better part of the last 7 years in the territory, and they knew it well if they hadn't grown up there to begin with. So the Shadow Warriors and Alith managed to evade the massive forces of the Malekith, the Witch King, but they had to scatter and had no chance of facing them in open battle. Alith and his Shadow Warriors tracked the army down south, and they eventually ended up clashing with the army of the Phoenix King, Kalidor, and there was a huge dragon fight that entailed, but Alith didn't really know the details, and it was only when the Phoenix King landed that all the Shadow Warriors emerged out of a tree line surrounding him completely, which led to him having a quite intimidating meeting, but they would also go on to have a conversation in the tent later on. So he presents himself at the encampment and is granted an audience with the Phoenix King. Alith walks in, all cocksure, and simply says, "You must be the Phoenix King, the one who calls himself Kalidor." The Phoenix King simply replied, "You must be Alith Anar, the one who calls himself the Shadow King." Alith recognized some old faces in the tent. The beautiful Princess Athiel was in there, his once love, who he'd given up for a life of vengeance and bloodshed. He tried not to let her presence affect him or cause him to falter. "I command the Shadow Warriors, the disappeared." And he goes on to tell Kalidor of the Witch King and that the Witch King is Malekith. They are one in the same. The whole room is struck by a state of disbelief. And they kind of ask him, how did you survive? And he goes on to tell the tale of how they scattered into the mountains and regrouped and tracked Malekith's army. So, having heard the tale, they got most of the gist of what was going on across the Phoenix King, and he asks, as any king would, for Alith's allegiance. However, Alith was pretty direct. "I will swear no oath to any king again. With no allegiance, Alith, there is no protection from me and my army. We don't need any of your protection, but we're the best hope of winning this war. What are you doing? This is crazy." And Alith just kind of turns to leave. "I just need you to understand that it's not going to happen. I'm not going to swear allegiance to you." He turns to the princess and says, "You can tell Finidel I'm alive if you want to," as kind of a, just a vague conversation starter as he turns to leave the tent. "You are a strange one, Alith, but if you need aid, send word, and Kalidor the Phoenix King will be there to help you." Alith turns and says, "You're an elf who took his grandfather's name and has a dragon as a best friend, and you call me strange? I am no dog to be called. I am a wolf, and I hunt in my own way. Nagaryth is not yours, Phoenix King. It is mine. Stay away." After this encounter, the two of them part ways. One presumes that Alith returns back to Nagaryth, causing what trouble he can, while keeping his shadows spread apart and using their guerrilla tactics. Now, the years kind of roll on at this stage, And it's about 25 years into the reign of Kalidor that the Battle of Malidor takes place. Finally, the decisive battles between the two sides, with Kalidor on one side and Malekith on the other. This is it. This is the fight for Ulthuan, and it is huge. Now, we're not going to get into a lot of detail about this fight in this video, because Alith isn't there. He's kind of maybe watching from a distance, but he isn't involved in this fight. But suffice it to say, Kalidor, the Phoenix King, wins the day and drives Malekith and Morathi back to Anlek and back to Nagaryth. Now, the army of Kalidor give chase, and eventually they cross the border into Nagaryth itself. And it's at this point, seemingly out of the woodland, when they've made camp for a night, that Alith arrived in front of the Phoenix King, what is now a wounded Phoenix King, and turns to Alith and says, "You are late." "I serve no king," replied Alith. "What do you want?" asked the Phoenix King. "I want you to leave Nagaryth. You are not welcome in my lands." 3,000 of my shadow warriors surround this camp. The Phoenix King brother orders all the troops in the room to raise their blades and bows, preparing for a fight. Kalidor simply says to Alith, "Malekith and Morathi both survived. I have to go to Anlek to finish this once and for all. You have done your part, Kalidor. What remains is the business of Nagaryth, and no other kingdom." "You need my help," insisted Kalidor. "We have never needed your help," cut in Alith. "I wish you no harm, but if you march on Anlek, we will stop you. When Malekith and Morathi are dealt with, you will hear of it from me." Kalidor not wanting a fight, his forces already severely depleted after the Battle of Malidor. They're exhausted, they're tired, many of them are wounded. Taking on 3,000 fresh shadow warriors is not something he wants to get involved in. And so he simply agrees. He's the one who turns first and says, "Okay, I'm going to leave. But if this isn't done by next spring, I'm coming back with a huge army. And if you are my enemy then, Alith, you better watch out. Perhaps your tongue will be the death of you and many others." So he kind of disappears off, and now it's up to Alith to finish the job. However, he never really gets an opportunity to do so. Very soon after this meeting, as Alith and the Shadow Warriors are moving towards Anlek, the ground of the entirety of Ulthuan begins to shake. The vortex begins to fade in the middle of the island. Demons start to emerge all over the island. The vortex is giving way. Then, suddenly, pillars of light emerge from within the vortex. Alith, like the rest of people, aren't exactly sure what's going on, and this causes a huge backlash. The quake grows even stronger. A huge tidal wave washes over a vast swathe of Nagaryth, absolutely decimating it from its former glories. The cities of the Druki detach and launch out into the sea. This is the Sundering, and the detachment of the Dark Elves from the island of Ulthuan, and Malekith's failed attempt to end the world because he had lost the war for Ulthuan and for the Phoenix throne. Alith sent word of the devastation that had struck his kingdom to the Phoenix King to keep him aware of the goings-on. After the Sundering, there was devastation. Hundreds of thousands were probably dead. Lots of the landmass of Nagaryth had been lost. But there were still some stragglers of the Druki in the mountains who were still fleeing back towards their home territory when the Sundering happened. Now this was when the Shadow Warriors came into their own, slaughtering these Druki as they found them. Amongst one of these bands that the Shadow Warriors had ambushed was Alandra, the father of Helbron, the one who thought he'd participated in the killing of Alith Anar himself. Alith and his Shadow Warriors caught him, and he was to be punished for his crimes, for the lives that the Shadow Warriors sacrificed to save the Shadow King that day. Alandra, whose vile loins had sired the vile Helbron, the butcher of Kafik. Once he was caught, he said, "Kill me." Alith reassured him, "We will, but no, not swiftly will you find death." "Then what are you gonna do, starve me?" "No, again, that would be too swift for you. So what we're going to do is tie you to this tree. Our people are long-lived, and trees grow tall. And every day, children from the village below will bring you food and drink to keep you alive. And this tree will grow inch by inch, day by day, and stretch out your body, giving you a torturous and slow death as this tree slowly grows on this hillside overlooking this land. You will die in agonizing pain and live in pain for many, many years of your long, long life. And such was the fate of the father of Helbron. They spent the remaining days hunting the Druki left over in their territory, committing some crazy acts that have now descended into legend. One was the Battle of Griffin Pass, after which they nailed 700 Druki to white cliffs overlooking the ocean and left them there until their flesh rotted off the nails with which they were driven into the cliffside. Then, Alith, not satisfied with his vengeance, not satisfied with having Nagaryth to his own, started his crusade across the ocean and hunted the Druki in their new lands. He would reave and slaughter them in their supposedly new and safe homes. He did not let up. He continued his quest for vengeance. It's even said that he got into the new halls and shared a dance at a ball with Morathi, just to prove he could get that close to her if need be. But he decided to, rather than kill her and give himself over to death, that he had many more Druki to slay in his lifetime, and so left her to live that day. However, his indiscretion did not go unnoticed, and a cadre of witch elves gave chase to him with their poisoned blades, and effectively chased him back to Ulthuan, ending his campaign in Nagaryth. Now, when he returned to Ulthuan, his final fate was unknown. Many centuries have passed since the time of the Sundering, and many have believed that perhaps he has died, but there are reports of this sort of grey-garbed figure kneeling in front of the tomb of Alith's father. It's said that the Shadow King has burned himself into the psyche of all Druki, even Malekith himself, who is said to be beyond fear, but if he did fear anything, it would be the vengeance of Alith Anar. Now, that's about it for the story of Alith. There are tales of his descendants sort of taking over the leadership of the Shadow Warriors, and it's sort of said that he sired many children over the years of his life. And to this day, it's said the descendants of Alith have never met or spoken to the Phoenix King since their last exchange. In general, the main consensus seems to be that Alith is sort of thought of as dead, but not really, and nobody knows. Now, the means by which he's perhaps extended his life this long, nobody really knows. It's kind of a mystery, but there are many magical ways you can do it in the Warhammer world. Maybe Kurnos himself decides to bless Alith with long life, and so he goes on living all this millennia later. So now let's have a look at how Alith played on the tabletop, for those of you who are interested. So he had a few items, some of which we've actually covered in this story. One of them was said to be the Stone of Midnight, stolen when he went to dance with Morathi, we presume, and this was said to be a gift from Anarion to Morathi that cloaks the wearer in shadow. Now, if a husband was to give a wife something that cloaks her in shadow, it's kind of the equivalent of a paper bag on her head, so maybe not the best gift to give to your wife, but that's what he gave her. So that's the idea. It would just cloak you in shadow and give you a ward save on the tabletop, and also make it harder to hit you with missile fire. He also, of course, has the Shadow Crown, the Crown of Nagaryth, which he stole from that gallery. And that, in essence, grants him Swift Stride on the tabletop, the idea being that it gives him the ability to pause time for a little bit when he wears it. It's sort of an innate gift with the Crown of Nagaryth that he gets. And of course, there is his Moonbow, which on the tabletop acts very much like a bolt thrower. It's that powerful, and it doesn't allow armor saves against it, and it gets an extra bonus when it's killing Dark Elves. So those were his magical items on the tabletop. As you can see here, the model was alright. It's not the best model that Games Workshop have ever made, but it's still a pretty decent model. Now, one last sort of dangling thread that I'm going to leave you guys here is there is the idea that, if you guys remember Alith's fiancée, who was with Helbron when she thought she killed Alith, now, there is accusations that she is the same Ashneel who was one of the original Dark Elves who washed up on the shore of Nehekara. Now, this is when a young mortuary priest by the name of Nagash found her, and from her dark magics managed to invent the art of necromancy. Now, she gets tortured a lot by Nagash, so don't worry, just for as far as loose strings are concerned, she might be the same Ashneel, and she gets her comeuppance too. But that's about it, guys. A bit of an uplifting one there. Alith, the King of Shadows, a kick-ass, vengeful-seeking, murderous, one could say lunatic at this stage, but he is pretty territorial and has a lot of dark corners of his psyche. I hope you enjoyed this first two-parter I've ever done on the Legendary Lords in Warhammer. And as always, guys, a huge thank you for watching, and I hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright, guys, bye.